Today, I'm going to be talking to you about elemental magic, both principles and practices. This is part one of what I'm thinking will be a 2 to 3 part series given the complexity of the topic. I'm going to start with a quote from Aleister Crowley's Gnostic Mass in the section called The Principles, where the deacon speaks, "Mysterious energy triform, mysterious matter in fourfold and sevenfold division, the interplay of which weaves the dance of the veil of life upon the face of the spirit. Let there be harmony and beauty in your mystic loves, that in us may be health and wealth and strength and divine pleasure according to the law of liberty. Let each pursue his will, as a strong man that rejoiceth in his way, as the course of a star that blazeth forever among the joyous company of heaven." And then the people say, "So mote it be." Where in a previous talk on planetary magic, we discussed the principle and magical formula working with the sevenfold division of the planets. In this talk, I intend to discuss the fourfold division of the elements, the qualitative differences between them, and some ways that one might work with them. The elements lay at the basis of Western Hermeticism, witchcraft, and thelema. Many work with them, but few know their origins as well as their associations with what is called Enochian magic, let alone how they fit into the path of attainment. If, as Crowley said, equilibrium is the basis of the work, elemental equilibrium is at the root of this, and tonight I'm going to unpack what that equilibrium consists of and how one might go about attaining it. So let's talk about the origin of the elements, and by that, I don't mean these, the periodic table you learned in high school and maybe college, and I also don't mean these elements, the famous wuxing you find at the heart of Chinese internal alchemy and medicine, though there have been efforts to map them to the Western version. Instead, I'm referring to these elements that are at the heart of Western occultism. There are other systems out there, but for the sake of brevity and common reference, we're going to stick with the 4 elements of Western Hermeticism. So let's get to their origins. You have to go back to the ancient Greeks to understand the origins of the elements as we've come to know them. In his book on the elements titled Practical Elemental Magic, David Rankine in the intro section provides us with a historical genealogy of them. According to Rankine, the concept of the elements in the West dates to the 5th century BC philosopher Empedocles. He thought the universe is composed of 4 essential substances, which he wrote about in his book, The Tetrasomia. He did not call them elements, which is Greek is stoichia. Rather, he called them rhizae, roots, or rhizomatas, root clumps. Aristotle expanded on the concept in his Degeneration and Corruption, starting to talk about the elements associated with qualities like hot and dry, cool and wet. The century before Pythagoras, Philios expanded them into a system of attributions, and the Pythagoreans associated the elements with natural cycle, things like the moist rainwater of spring, the dry hot fire and growth of summer, the dryness and stiffness of earth in the fall, and the cool air and death in winter. These ideas of the elements are carried forward from the Greeks in various forms to the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, till you get to the alchemists of the 15th and 16th centuries, who start to refine the concepts of the elements in relationship to alchemical processes. For example, the 16th century alchemical work by Simon Forman, wherein he writes about the elements, stating, "Then out of this chaos, the 4 elements were made, heat and cold, moist and dry, and likewise which are the beginnings of all creatures wide, that under the globe of Luna abide." These basic attributions get passed on through various Hermetic and Rosicrucian orders from the 16th to 19th centuries, leading us to the Hermetic order of the Golden Dawn. They built on these attributions to create their own magical correspondences and give us the basic systems we're all working with today, expressed in Crowley's 777 and other works. Now I'm going to be building up a set of correspondences for the 4 elements. In the Golden Dawn system, one is first introduced to these correspondences in the Neophyte lecture, a Neophyte knowledge lecture of the Golden Dawn, and in more detailed form in the 5th knowledge lecture for the Philosophus grade. Essentially, all the elements are seen to have qualities of hot and cold, wet and dry, based on the earlier Aristotelian attributions mentioned. These are their qualities which are further expanded upon in layers with additional correspondences. So using the Aristotelian attributions, you get fire as hot and wet, like the blood from a fresh beating heart or the steam from a geyser. Water is cold and wet, like a deep pool of water in winter. Air is hot and dry, like the wind in a desert. And earth is cold and dry, like the ground in winter. So starting off using Aristotle's hot, dry, cold, wet formula for each of the elements, we'll begin with fire. So I'll start with this quote from the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, who gave us this idea that all things are in flux. He wrote, "Fire lives in the death of earth, air lives in the death of fire, water lives in the death of air, and air in the death of water." This sounds very similar to the generation cycle of the elements in Chinese medicine, but that aside, fire is the first element in the Golden Dawn attribution. This has a lot to do with the Tetragrammaton, or fourfold world of God, name of God, which I'll describe in a moment. So here are just some of the central attributions to fire. In Hermeticism, it's associated with will or the originating intention. Its additional qualities include ambition or courage, the drive towards manifestation. The archangel is Michael. The elemental beings are salamanders. Its weapon is the wand. The power of the Sphinx is to will, and it's often associated with the south. Moving on, let's talk about water. Heraclitus wrote, "All things flow, nothing abides. You cannot step in the same river twice, for the waters are continually flowing on. Nothing is permanent except change." So water is associated with feeling, imagination, the sea of emotion that receives the originating intention. Additional qualities: receptivity, emotionality, sometimes intuition, understanding. The archangel is Gabriel. The elemental beings are the Undines. Its magical weapon is the cup. And the power of the Sphinx is to dare, and oftentimes is associated with the West. Moving on. Air is hot and dry. It's often associated with thought. Additional qualities include analysis or discernment or logic. The archangel is Raphael. The elemental beings are the sylphs. Its magic weapon is the dagger or blade. The power of the Sphinx is to know, and it's often associated with the East. And finally, Earth is cold and dry. It's often associated with materiality. Additional qualities are manifestation, solidity, or embodiment. The archangel is Uriel or Oriel, depending. The elemental being are gnomes. Its magical weapon is the disc or pentacle. The power of the Sphinx is to keep silent, and it's often the north. So that, in essence, is the basics of the 4 classical elements in Hermeticism. Now, I've only mentioned a few of the correspondences, but there are many, many more, as seen in this table from Rankine's book that maps to sabbats, seasons, animals, astrological signs, perfumes, etc. You can use this chart, 777, or many other similar reference books to build up your own materials in any magical work you choose to do that brings these elements into your life specifically. Now I'll make a bit of a detour. There are different paradigms you can approach magic with. In his still highly relevant paper, The Models of Magic, Frater UD, a longtime member of Fraternitas Saturni and the Illuminates of Thanateros, talked about different ways you can think about magic. He defines a spirit model perspective, which is basically animism, seeing an ensouled universe as full of spirits, intelligences, and entities. He also discusses the psychological model, which is basically Jung, and the notion of archetypes, along with others like the information and energetic model. Each model both reveals and conceals some component of magical praxis in the world thereof. I myself tend to work with a spirit model in my magic, though I've spent time in depth with Jung since 1997, and he takes a respected place in my library. I tend not want to psychologize my magical work, preferring instead to work within an animistic worldview of forces, energies, and powers outside of myself. There are arguments on both sides, as above, so below, as within, so without. But I tend to follow along with Stephen Skinner and others pretty heavily on the animist side of things, feeling that this creates the most potent form of magical practice in line with the shamanistic traditions and how they've been doing this kind of work for over 50,000 years. That said, there are those who choose to work with the psychological model and have created their own attributions layered onto the 4 elements. Using Jung's feeling, sensing, knowing, intuition, 4-fold model for the functions of the psyche, they've tried to fit these onto the classical 4 elements of Hermeticism I've mentioned above. In this case, intuition is replacing will, which I find doesn't work for me. The mapping of fire to intuition and the fact that Jung doesn't focus a lot on the will is a big gap in applying the psychological model to thelemic magic, in my opinion, given its primary focus on the will. For as Martin Heidegger says in his book, The End of Philosophy, Consciousness belongs to the will. The will to will is the highest and unconditional consciousness. This in turn would fit very well with the first principle in the Tetragrammaton being fire, the originating intention that then manifests down through the four worlds to bring about change in the world. This in turn also dovetails with the notion of Ika Shakti, or the power of the will, which is a driving primary force of creation in Shaivite Tantra. Nonetheless, it is a model that some people work with, and it's worthy of consideration. Now, according to the attributions of Hermetic Kabbalah, which is the backbone of ceremonial magic, there are additional elemental attributions associated with what is called the Kabbalistic four worlds, and the Tetragrammaton, or fourfold name of the divine. This name in Hebrew, Yod-He-Vav-He, sometimes pronounced Jehovah by layfolk, is the God name of the creator as manifest through these four worlds, according to both traditional Hermetic Kabbalists and classic Kabbalists. So the four worlds at the top, you have Atziluth, the archetypal world. This is associated with fire. Next, you have Bria, the creative world. This is associated with water, followed by Yetzirah, the world of form, which is associated with the air. And finally, Asiya, the world of materiality, which is associated with earth. So you can use the four worlds to think about the creative and magical process and how the powers of magic manifest through the four elements. So for instance, you start with the Hebrew letter Yod, the first world, which is named Atziluth, the archetypal world, which is the principle of fire. Here behind all things is your core will or intent for love, which is that for the sake of union. For I'm divided for love's sake, for the sake of union. From this, you basically have the originating intention of the will to love. And then from that fiery intention, things then coalesce into a feeling in the world of Bria, which is associated with water, the creative world. The imagined ideal coalesces into a motion and a feeling state where one can understand on a deep level how love begins to play itself out in one's life. What is the feeling tone? Thus, it's so important in magical practice that one invests a lot of emotion into the desired willed object. Otherwise, it's going to be flat. This watery idea then starts to coalesce into air, where it starts to take shape into an actual form in the formative world of Yetzirah associated with the air element. Here, that idea, that feeling tone, that will, and that emotion comes together in actual blueprint of what is the state of ideal lovers. What would that look like? What would that be in one's mind's eye? What is that beyond just an emotion, initial willed impulse and a feeling? How does that actually look in the imagination? And this is playing out in the astral plane. And this in turn coalesces finally into the world of Asiya, which is associated with earth. And it takes form in a talisman, a sigil, candle magic, goetia, any other way in which you ground that initial intention in some tangible way in the realm of the earth, so that it's not just a lofty abstraction, but it's actually manifest. So you can see the four worlds of fire, water, air, and earth, the magical process moving down through the four worlds, through the four elements. In turn, these four worlds are associated with the tarot suits of wands, cups, swords, and pentacles, and they play themselves out in a nuanced complexity that is worthy of a deep, in-depth study, which we won't go into today, but understand that this process of creation, starting with the will, coalescing into a material basis, is basically a movement of the elements, that originating fire of the will, down into the creative process of manifestation. So you have four elements. The archetypal power of passion in the will formulates the seed of intention. The realm of feeling and the imagination receives that intention, which in turn gives birth to a plan. The formative realm of thought and intellect cuts with analysis, molding that plan into a realizable blueprint. And finally, the material realm of the body and materiality brings that plan down to earth in material basis, like a talisman or any other act of manifest change, like a resume. Any way, any magical link that transmits the will into the world of action. This is true at the level of the macrocosm and the microcosm, for as above, so below, as within, so without. For as Crowley says in Liber al Vel Magi, with the wand createth he, With the cup preserveth he, with the dagger destroyeth he, with the coin redeemeth he, his weapons fulfill the wheel. Now, the Golden Dawn added another layer of the elements associated with the tattvas, drawn from Eastern yogic sources. This was mapped to the tattva tides, which are similar, which are different elemental qualities associated with different times of day. This is similar to the notion of planetary days and hours, which we've talked about previously. It's a system worthy of exploration, but not today. Furthermore, using yogic theory, each element can in turn be mapped to a chakra, starting at the root chakra with Muladhara as earth, moving up to the genital area, Svadhisthana, associated with water, and then moving on to the navel point, Manipura, the will, associated with fire, and finally moving to the heart chakra, Visuddha, associated with air. The fifth chakra and up are often associated with spirit, which we'll talk about in a moment. Altogether, this association of the elements, the chakras, is a detailed study in itself and worthy of its own discussion. So we'll leave that there at this time. Now, in order to stay focused on Western Hermeticism, we need to make a segue to understand another layered component onto the elements that make them what they are today in modern day occultism. We could spend an entire day or more talking about the works of John Dee and Edward Kelly, their channeled visions from the spirits in the 1500s in what has come to be known as the Enochian language and the magic thereof. What we do know is that John Dee and Edward Kelly, scrying with a shoe stone, downloaded the watchtowers, this picture above being an original rendition, which the Golden Dawn equated to the 4 cardinal points and thus the elemental associations thereof after the initial revelation was reformed by the Archangel Raphael. These association of the 4 watchtowers with the 4 elements are foundational for the initiatory system of the Golden Dawn, and also structure the way it uses the pentagram that enables one to banish or invoke elemental energies. The Golden Dawn, or McGregor Mathers, built on the Enochian revelations of John Dee and Edward Kelly, creating a tidy system of attributions of the elements to the watchtower surrounded by the 30 aethers. These progress from the densest closest to the material plane, called the 30th aether Tex, to the most subtle and furthest from our plane, called Lil. Crowley would go on later in his career to scry these 30 aethers, first in Mexico, before he received the Book of the Law, and after 1909, while he was with Victor Neuburg in Algeria. This gave us the vision of the voice, which contains some of the core metaphysical principles of Thelema. In the Equinox, Crowley boiled the essentials of the Golden Dawn Enochian system down into a book called Liber Hanok. In this, he writes, the sides of the squares are the 4 great watchtowers, which are attributed to the elements. The great cross divides the tablet into 4 lesser sub-elemental tablets, the left-hand top corner being air of air, the right-hand top corner water of air, the left-hand bottom corner earth of air, the remaining corner fire of air, unquote. So this leads in essence to 16 divisions of those original 4 elements. So 16 nuances of the 4. So thinking about the great tablet, in the lower right, or the fire element, you have 4 sub-elements. Starting clockwise in the upper left, you have air of fire, then you have water, fire, 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 and then earth of fire. So what that might look like in these terms, in essence, is here. So for instance, fire of fire in the lower right is the fieriest of fire. That might be equivalent to a nuclear, explosion, right? Whereas air of fire, that might be more like a continuous flame from a campfire, something that's steadier. Similarly, something in the upper right, like air of air, that might be, a steady moving air, like a current. But then you have fire of air in the lower right, up the top left quadrant, and that might be a hurricane. So the point being is that the elements have a lot of nuance beyond, fire, water, air, and earth, and using a system like the quadrature of the Enochian system can help you start to drill down into those qualities and call upon them if you choose to use this methodology to engage spirit. So these are notes from longtime Thelemite and Enochian scholar David Richard Jones, where you can see the associated attributions of the elements, the watchtowers, and the subsequent Enochian angel names associated with the watchtowers and the sub-elements as well. This all becomes very important in more sophisticated forms of invocation, and evocation. But for now, just grasping the associations of the watchtowers is fine. You can summon the angels associated with each of the sub-elements or the tablets themselves in the Enochian hierarchy and experience the qualities thereof. The point here is that there is a very nuanced and detailed way to dial into the elements through Enochian magic. One of the most basic ways that people experience elements today is the pentagram, and we'll be talking about that more in a moment. According to Enochian scholar Donald Tyson, the assignment of the elements to the pentagram was conditioned by the elemental associations of the fixed signs of the zodiac. These zodiac associations are very ancient and serve as the basis for the Golden Dawn association of the elements. So when you layer a pentagram on top of a zodiacal wheel, it lines up pretty tightly with the fixed signs. Therefore, in the upper left corner, you get air, upper right corner, you get water, lower left corner, you get earth, and lower right corner, you get fire. Mathers goes on to map these zodiacal attributions to the Reformed Great Table in the order shown above, creating a tidy and coherent attribution of both the zodiacal fixed signs in their elemental form, along with the Enochian qualities. So you can basically layer the pentagram on top of the watchtowers I mentioned above, and you get this tidy syncing of the four quarters of the Enochian watchtowers, in turn mapped to the four corners of the zodiacal fixed signs. That's why when you go about doing your banishing or invoking, you're going to be starting at different points, because you're going to be calling on different energies. So the point of elemental magic is to either banish or invoke elemental forces to tonify or sedate those qualities in one's own sphere of sensation, subtle body or aura, and thus prepare one for relevant invocations or evocations of spiritual forces aligned with the will of the magician. The pentagram is the operative tool used in elemental magic, just as the hexagram is the operative tool used in planetary magic. There are exceptions, but for now, let's just go with that. In Liber O, Crowley shows us the basic permutations of both the invoking and banishing pentagrams of spirit and the elements. To invoke, you draw from spirit towards the element, and to banish, you draw from the element towards spirit. So going back upstream, or looking just here at the center, you can see that for invoking pentagram of air, you would start, if you wanted to invoke it, you would basically be going from, in the case of air, you're going to be going from water towards air. And then to banish, you're going to be going from air towards water. But for the others, for instance, the fire pentagram, you'd be drawing if you wanted to invoke it, you would be going from spirit down towards the lower right. If you wanted to banish fire, you'd be going from fire up towards spirit. So if the people want to know why, though, you're doing that because of, as I mentioned, you're mapping back upstream here to the fixed signs of the zodiac and to the Enochian tablets that have been layered on top, that the pentagram has been layered on top of. So pentagrams are the basis of significant parts of ceremonial magic. Everything from the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram to the supreme invoking ritual of pentagram uses the same basic pentagram mentioned above. Chick Cicero, the chief adept of my offshoot Golden Dawn lineage, explains the benefits or purposes of different elemental pentagram rituals. Paraphrasing him, these are basically why you use them. Use them to set up the Theurgist magical circle protection, to consecrate the sacred space with specific elemental energies, to balance and harmonize the elements involved, to pinpoint single elemental energies for extreme emphasis in a working, to center and balance at the cross of the invoked elements, to imprint one's spirit, imprint one's psyche with the balanced elements invoked, and finally to create more complex rituals with talismans, consecrations, invocations, evocations, divination, spiritual work, and spiritual vision. So basically, the pentagram is like the multi-tool for a lot of the magic that you're doing in the Golden Dawn style system, as well as witchcraft, which was inspired by the Golden Dawn. So I'm not going to teach all the different ways to work pentagrams in ritual. The basic forms and processes are described clearly in Libra O in the section titled The Lesser Ritual of the Pentagram. In that section, it doesn't say whether it's a banish or invoking form, but you can swap out pentagram tracings as shown in Libra O to bring about the desired elemental qualities, either banishing or invoking. I encourage each person to experiment with the formulas in Libra O as this operation requires, and as your operation requires, and to keep a magical record. I'm going to talk a little bit about the different types of pentagram rituals and how they vary in this next section. So what a lot of people are familiar with is the lesser banishing ritual, the pentagram. And that is table stakes or sort of a baseline for a lot of the further work you do, where you create the Kabbalistic cross and you do a banishing earth pentagram in 4 directions, calling upon the archangels Raphael, Gabriel, Michael, and Uriel to create sacred space, and then repeating the Kabbalistic cross. That's kind of the bottom line pentagram work that a lot of people are familiar with. And it goes up from there. You start adding things in the next levels. So for instance, the greater invoking ritual and banishing rituals, the pentagram, you're adding in the grade signs of the elements, and you're bringing in the passive and active pentagrams of spirit to basically add more energy. So think of going from lesser to greater as basically just adding gas to the intensity of the elemental banishing or invocation. And finally, the supreme invoking ritual of the pentagram continues all that, but it adds in Enochian words of power, cherubic symbols, and the elemental grades to basically further amplify the ritual. I used this myself over the course of 6 months when I was doing work in my portal grade of the Golden Dawn, where for 1 month I did 3 times a day a balanced form of a supreme invoking ritual, the pentagram. And then for 1 month each, I did an unbalanced version. So for 1 month, I did a 3-month cycle, a 3 times day cycle of invoking fire with the supreme invoking ritual, the pentagram. And then for 1 month, invoking water. And for 1 month, only invoking earth and for air. And for 1 month, only invoking earth. And then finally, a balanced, the idea, and I basically threw myself in a state of pretty strong imbalance. When I was in fire at the end, I was a rageaholic. And when I was in water, I was deeply emotional. When I was in air, I was up in the clouds. And when I was deep in earth, I could only think about money. And so the point being is that I was pushing myself to my own elemental edges so that then I would rebalance myself at the end, having thus drawn a plumb line through the experience of these elements in their extreme form, and thus creating integration and balance, equilibrium being the basis of the work. So very powerful set of tools there, depending on what you're trying to do. Finally, the thelemic version, the star ruby, is basically the thelemic version of the lesser banished ritual of the pentagram, which also invokes solar phallic energy in the form of pan. So it's a fascinating ritual because it combines a bit of an invocation with a banishing at the same time. But yeah, just all these are different ways in which one can call upon these elemental qualities. Now, this is the Rosy Cross of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and it contains within it the heart of the mysteries in symbolic form. Just looking at it, you can see it very clearly. The elements are baked into the Rosy Cross. You have the very top, you have air, and you have the right one, which is water, the lowest one is earth, and the left one is fire. So the elements are framing the entire structure of the Rosy Cross, and thus the Golden Dawn system itself. Now, as one goes through the initial grades in the first order of the Golden Dawn, organized around the Tree of Life, each grade is associated with an element. As you can see at the bottom here, you start off as a neophyte, and then you're initiated into Zalater, which is associated with earth. Then from there, you're initiated into Theoricus, associated with air. Continue to climb the tree. You're initiated into Practicus, associated with water. And finally, Philosophus, associated with fire. So as one progresses through each of these grades, the aspirant is meant to familiarize themselves with the elements and get a sort of flavor for them. But all this sort of comes together in the portal grade, where one is meant to undergo an act of synthesis where these elements were brought together in the magician, just like the four corners of the pyramid were laid in preparation for the aspirant's initiation of the grade of Adeptus Minor. The bottom line is the equilibration of the four elements, as seen in the Rosy Cross, is at the heart of the Golden Dawn system, and this goes on to express itself in Crowley's work built on that. So whether we're talking about the star ruby, the star sapphire, Libra Samek, or even his vision-associated conversations associated with his guardian angel in Liber Cordis Serpente, or the book of the heart girth round the serpent, you see this motif of the four elements in their equilibrium playing out. So I'm just going to mention a little bit more detail of how the four elements play out in some of Crowley's work. In Liber Samek, being the ritual employed by him in service of Frank Bennett, who wanted to have a tool in the AA system to attain his holy guardian angel. He was one of Crowley's top AA students from Australia that worked up through the AA system. Crowley created this ritual that basically invokes, using Aver's pentagrams, the four elements, as well as the principles of above and below. And that in itself, you can see baked in the HJ work itself, the elemental equilibrium is at its very heart. As I already mentioned, Liber Cordis Serpente, Crowley is speaking from the voice of the experience of the angel through the four elements and spirit, which I'll talk about here in a second. So these two sort of foundational thelemic rituals and works, you see the four elements playing themselves out. And this theme continues throughout Crowley's writing. Experience and equilibrium of the elements are so central that Crowley, in commenting on the morals of Liber All and Magic Without Tears, makes a decisively critical comment about the elemental unbalances of Adolf Hitler. He writes, "He served up the people only such concoctions that would tickle their gross palates. Worse still, he was the slave of his prophetic frenzy. He had not undertaken the balancing regimens of the curriculum of AA, and worst of all, he was very far indeed from being a full initiate, even in the loosest sense of the term." Some say Hitler tapped occult energies for his initial success, and he may very well have, but he did so in a way completely out of elemental equilibrium, and the results for both himself and the large world are evident. Equilibrium of the elements is so central to thelemic magic that it makes its way into a key document used at a certain stage of initiation in one of Crowley's initiatory rites. In Liber Librae, the importance of elemental equilibrium is clearly stated. "Be thou, therefore, prompt and active as the sylphs, but avoid frivolity and caprice. Be energetic and strong like the salamanders, but avoid irritability and ferocity. Be flexible and attentive to images like the undines, but avoid idleness and changeability. Be laborious and patient like the gnomes, but avoid grossness and avarice. So shalt thou gradually develop the powers of the soul and fit thyself to the command the spirits of the elements." So here it's clear familiarity and equilibrium with the four elements and the counterbalancing of opposites. It's clear that these are very central to thelemic magic. You'll notice in this talk I've been focusing solely on the classical four elements, but there is a fifth element, in some ways the most important one, called Akasha, spirit, or the Azoth. It's the integrative synthesis that unites the four in a higher order combination that both contains them and transcends them. The fifth element in Hermetics is considered to be more refined than the four elemental forces. Some call it spirit, others call it aether or quintessence, literally the fifth element in Latin. The element of spirit is seen to be a bridge between the physical and the subtle realms. Within the microcosm, the spirit is the bridge between the body and soul. The work done in the elemental grades in the Golden Dawn is meant to prepare the aspirant for the integrative synthesis in the portal grade. This integration of opposites is associated with the path of Samek, arrow, in the Tarot, and Sagittarius that connects the spear of Yesod with Tiferet. It's mapped to Tarot and the art card, which is a symbol of the alchemical union of opposites. For Crowley says, the great work is the uniting of opposites. It may mean the uniting of the soul with God, of the microcosm with the macrocosm, of the female with the male, of the ego with the non-ego. In the portal grade, a platform is built like a pyramid so that the quintessence of the Azoth of spirit can be prepared and an alchemical union of opposites can be made in preparation for knowledge and conversation with one's holy guardian angel, as seen in this painting by Jack Parsons' widow, Marjorie Cameron. These are deep mysteries worthy of much study and practice, but I'll leave you with this. In the movie The Fifth Element, which this still capture is from, Bruce Willis goes on a quest to gather the stones that help invoke the 4 elements we've discussed: fire, water, air, and earth. But it's the integrative 5th principle of spirit in the form of the supreme being Lilu, played by Mila Jovovich, that brings them all together in a higher order synthesis that empowers her to emit a divine light that stops the destruction of Earth by a hurling meteor of profound evil. Sci-fi Hollywood excesses aside, the movie rests on archetypal ideas we've expressed in this talk, and the 4 elements are united in a higher order synthesis via a 5th that gives them their true power. Elvis Leve unpacked the occult symbol of Baphomet. Each part of Baphomet represents an element. The pentagram upright on Baphomet's head is the element of spirit. The hooves are earth. The scales are water. The wings are air. And the torch is fire. Aleister Crowley shared this with us. The devil does not exist. It is a false name invented by the Black Brothers to imply a unity in their ignorant muddle of dispersion. A devil who had a unity would be a god. The devil is historically the god of any people that one personally dislikes. This serpent, Satan, is not the enemy of man, but he who made gods of our race, knowing good and evil. He bade know thyself and taught initiation. He is the devil of the book of Thoth, and his emblem is Baphomet, the androgyne, who is the hieroglyph of arcane perfection. He is therefore life and love, but moreover his letter is Ion, the eye, so that he is light, and his zodiacal image is Capricornus, that leaping goat whose attribute is liberty. So from the Greeks to Baphomet, we've seen the elements and their role in Western Hermeticism and Thelema. The pentagram, as the quintessential symbol of now 5 elements, is the foundational tool we use to formally invoke and banish them in ceremonial magic. But it's in our very lives where in our work and love, conflict and cooperation, strife and harmony, thought and deed, the elements play themselves out. The pentagram is but a symbol for the fullness of one's humanity, in all of one's faculties as one goes about the task of living and pursuing the great work. So I'll leave you all with a poem by Aleister Crowley titled The Pentagram that summarizes this thought. The Pentagram. In the years of the primal course, in the dawn of terrestrial birth, man mastered the mammoth and horse, and man was the lord of the earth. He made him a hollow skin from the heart of a holy tree. He compassed the earth therein, and man was the lord of the sea. He controlled the vigor of steam. He harnessed the lightning for hire. He drove the celestial team, and man was the lord of the fire. Deep-mouthed from their thrones deep-seated, the choirs, the aeons declare, the last of the demons defeated, for man is the lord of the air. O rise, O man, in thy strength, the kingdom is thine to inherit, till the high gods witness at length that man is the lord of his spirit. Thank you.